Hello everyone, it's Scott, and we're back to talk about the top cards from Murders at Karlov Manor that are going to impact Standard. And the way I've done this is I've broken it down into 4 sets of cards. Our Mythic rares, our uncommons, and commons, because I think cards from all 4 areas are going to have an impact. So today we're going to talk about the Mythic rares from the set. Tomorrow we'll hit our rares, and then later on in the week we'll hit our uncommons and commons that are going to have a role to play in Standard. And remember, that doesn't mean necessarily they're going to have a role to play in the next 2 or 3 months as we wait for the next set to come out, but over the course of the next 3 years that they're going to be playable, I think all of them will find homes in Standard at some point. But before we get into the cards, remember to like and subscribe to get further content like this throughout the rest of Murders at Karlov Manor season and then in preview seasons to come. Alright, let's dive into the top 10 Mythic rares. So first is Rakdos, Patron of Chaos for 4, a black and a red mana. You legendary creature, that's a demon. Rakdos is a 6/6 with flying and trample. And at the beginning of your end step, target opponent may sacrifice 2 non-land, non-token permanents. If they don't, you draw 2 cards. So a very powerful ability on Rakdos. I would say you're probably playing this at the end of your second main phase, so your opponent really can't do much in terms of responding. This ability triggers, goes on the stack at the beginning of your end step, and then they have to either sacrifice those 2 permanents or you get to draw 2 cards. And I think because of that, this is the top end of a Rakdos deck in Standard, and maybe even the current mid-range deck might want a couple copies of it as the top end. Next, we've got at number 9, Karlov Voltstrider for 1, a blue and a red mana. You get an artifact vehicle. It's a 4/4, and you get the ability to collect evidence 6. Karlov Strider becomes an artifact creature until end of turn, and that's a very important piece of this card. And this is why I think there's some confusion about the way the card works at times. So at some point, you're going to have to go ahead and collect evidence of 6 with Karlov is Voltstrider. So you get the attack triggers with it. So whenever Karlov's Voltstrider attacks, you may cast an instant or sorcery card from among cards exiled with it. If that spell would be put into a graveyard, put it on the bottom of its owner's library instead. And it does have a crew cost of 2. So I think one of the earliest times you play this, you might be crewing it for a turn or 2, or if you do have in your graveyard the ability to click 6 evidence, then you're going to do that, and then all of those instants and sorceries that you're exiling, you'll have the ability either that turn or over the course of the next several turns to be able to play those. And then once you've exhausted that set of cards, then you collect 6 evidence again, and you do the same thing. So I think this has got that repeatable cycle to it that will make it probably have a pretty good stay in Standard. In number 8, we have Kaya's Spirit's Justice. For 2, a white and a black mana, the legendary planeswalker Kaya with 3 loyalty. And whenever one or more creatures you control and or creature cards in your graveyard are put into exile, you may choose a creature card from among them. Until end of turn, target token you control becomes a copy of it, except it has flying. So nice, powerful ability. And we do have the ability to flicker some cards in Standard, so that's a possibility working with a static ability on Kaya. But if you don't do that, you can certainly +2, you get Surveil 2, and then exile a card from a graveyard, most likely exile a creature. And assuming you have a creature token in play, then what you're going to do is make that creature token that creature for the turn and give it flying on top of that. So it'll most likely be able to attack in, do damage, get an ability, and move on from there. Now, her +1, you get to create a 1/1 black and white spirit creature token with flying. So you have the ability to create a token if you need one to benefit from the first ability. And then for -2, you can exile target creature you control. For each other player, exile up to 1 target creature that player controls. So if you need to early in the game, your opponent's got a really difficult creature that you're having a hard time dealing with, and you don't have a removal spell for it, Kaya can remove it simply by you exiling one of your creatures. And then again, when you do so, if you have a token in play, then you get the benefit of the static ability, where you're not going to lose that creature on that particular turn because you're going to get it back and make that creature token that, and that will allow you to go ahead and attack in with it at that point with flying, which is, again, a nice ability in any card that you see. At 7, we've got Angrath, the Quake Mole. For 2, a red and a green mana, you get a legendary creature that's a mole god. Angrath is 8/4, and whenever Angrath, the Quake Mole, becomes blocked, untap each creature you control. After this combat phase, there is an additional combat phase. And for 3, 2 red and 2 green mana, Angrath must be blocked each combat this turn if able. So if you've got the ability to pour 7 mana into this, you can force your opponent to block, which will give you an additional combat phase at least once. And if they've got enough creatures in play that would survive combat, then you would be attacking it a second time and maybe even a third time. And I think that's a really powerful ability. Now, the card that I think works really well with this is the Yaris card we also got. It's a 4 mana card as well, but it gives all of your creatures haste. And I think that's really what you want to see happen with Angrath. You want to be able to give Angrath haste, so the turn it comes into play, it's going to immediately attack. And it may force your opponent to block, especially if they're so close to dying where they can't take that 8 power hit on their life total. And that would force them to block, and that means you're going to get another combat phase. So very, very powerful creature. And if this sets up as well as I think it could, this might be the most powerful creature in the set from an aggro perspective. At number 6, we've got Agis cost. Spirit of Justice. For 2, a red and a white mana, you get a legendary creature that's a Spirit Detective, and a 2/4. Cost has double strike and vigilance, and whenever Agis cost, Spirit of Justice enters the battlefield or attacks, choose up to 1 target creature. If it's suspected, exile it, otherwise suspected. So I think cost really fits well in any kind of deck that you're going to be able to suspect cards before you play cost. Because really what you want to do is when cost comes into play, you want to be able to go ahead and exile one of your opponent's creatures that's already been suspected. And then when you attack with cost on the next turn, if there isn't a creature that's already suspected, then you get to suspect it, and assuming cost survives combat on that turn, then you would get to exile it at that point. So cost potentially has a very, very powerful ability of being able to just exile your opponent's cards turn after turn after turn. You can get rid of creatures that your opponent has, and over a short period of time, you'll be able to whittle their board down to a place where it's going to be really hard for them to compete against cost unless they can get cost off the field. Next, we've got Alqu, Prof, Master Sleuth at number 5. For 1, a white and a blue mana, you legendary creature that's a human detective with vigilance and is a 3/3. And when Alqu, Prof, Master Sleuth enters the battlefield, you get to investigate. So just like we saw with cost, there's an enter the battlefield trigger that helps you in that game. You get that investigate token, which means you've got a clue now, and you can crack that clue to go ahead and draw a card with it, or you can use Prof's ability, which is for X, a white, and 2 blue mana. You can sacrifice a clue, and you get to draw X cards and gain X life. So very powerful ability there on Prof. And if you're able to do this just once or twice, and you're able to pump 3 or 4 mana into this, I think that's really a game-winning strategy there, where you're going to gain enough life and then also gain enough card advantage. If you can do this several times over the course of the game, it will be really powerful in terms of the card advantage that it's going to generate for you. Next, we've got at number 4, Incinerator of the Guilty. For 4 and 2 red mana, you get a creature that's a dragon. Incinerator of the Guilty is a 6/6. It has flying and trample. And whenever Incinerator of the Guilty deals combat damage to a player, you may collect evidence X. When you do, Incinerator of the Guilty deals X damage to each creature and each planeswalker that player controls. So Incinerator of the Guilty is a busted card potentially in Standard, because if there's a way that you can haste him into play, where you attack the turn that he comes into play, your opponent probably has killed a few things over the course of the game, and for all the evidence you collect, you're going to be able to do that much damage to your opponent's creatures and potentially wipe their board and leave your board state safe and sound because it doesn't affect yours. So I'm interested in trying this in Standard, and I think it's going to find a home at some point in the Standard format. At number 3, we've got Massacre Girl, known killer for 2 and 2 black mana. You legendary creature. That's a human assassin. Massacre Girl has menace and is 4/4, and creatures you control have wither. They deal damage to creatures in the form of -1/-1 counters. Whenever a creature an opponent controls dies, if its toughness was less than 1, you get to draw a card. So the way I see Massacre Girl is she is a draw card engine, because if you have creatures that are going to attack in front of this, and I think you're going to be using this in an aggro / mid-range strategy where you're going to try to get a bunch of creatures out in the first few turns, and then once you've got a pretty good board state, you're going to go ahead and attack in and give all of your opponent's creatures damage in the form of -1/-1 counters. Some it's going to kill, others it's going to weaken, and the result of that is over a couple of turns, you're going to probably eliminate your opponent's board. And the great thing about that is that once you do, every time one of those creatures dies, you get to draw a card. So you can generate a tremendous amount of card advantage from Massacre Girl, and that's why she's coming in at number 3. At number 2 is Tomic, Wielder of Law. For 1, a white and a black mana, you get a legendary creature that's a human advisor, and Tomic is a 2/4 with flying and vigilance. Tomic also has affinity for planeswalkers. This spell costs 1 less to cast for each planeswalker you control. And whenever an opponent attacks with creatures, if 2 or more of those creatures are attacking you or planeswalkers you control, each opponent loses 3 life, and you draw a card. So this is an ability on Tomic that is going to help you control the board. Because if your opponent's playing an aggro strategy, they're going to be attacking. It doesn't matter what you're doing, they're going to keep attacking. So Tomic probably trades up well with things, because the 2 damage against lower toughness creatures is probably enough to kill them, but your 4 toughness is going to be strong enough for you to survive those combats. And then on top of that, you get the added benefit of when your opponent attacks with 2 or more creatures, attacks you or a planeswalker, they lose 3 life and you get to draw a card. So for not doing anything, okay, just letting your opponent attack, you can have your opponent lose 3 life and draw a card, and that's just a powerful ability in any format. So I can actually see Tomic possibly seeing play in other formats as well. Now, the one downside to Tomic is this. Tomic is a pre-release card. Now, Tomic and 2 other pre-release cards can only be found in pre-release kits. So if you want Tomic, you're probably going to need to get some pre-release kits to get him, because otherwise he's not going to be all that available, because again, he's only coming in pre-release kits. Now, the good side of this is because he is coming in pre-release kits, there'll be lots and lots of pre-release kits, so there may be an ample supply of this, but I'm really not sure how many we're going to see as opposed to Malik or Voja. So we'll have to see how that distribution ends up. And at number 1, coming in at number 1, we have Delaney Streetwise Lookout for 2 and a white mana. You get a legendary creature that's a human scout. Creatures you control with power 2 or less can't be blocked by creatures with power 3 or greater. So all of your small creatures, your opponent can't block if the opponent has a power 3 or greater with that particular creature, so they can only trade their small creatures with your creatures. And if an ability of a creature you control with power 2 or less triggers, that ability triggers an additional time. So I can see this very, very easily going into the human deck because we've got a lot of cards that have enter the battlefield triggers that have power 2 or less, like Voldaren Epicure, where you play Voldaren Epicure, it does 1 damage, and it also gets you a blood token. So this is giving the opponent 2 damage, giving you 2 blood tokens when you have Delaney on the field and you play Voldaren Epicure as just an example. And we've got so many cards in white in standard that have enter the battlefield abilities that I don't think you're going to have a problem really benefiting from this. And this could be potentially a very busted card depending on what kind of deck it finds its home in standard. All right, those are the top 10 Mythic cards from Murders at Karlov Manor that I believe over the next 3 years are going to have a place in standard. Now, some of them will be immediate, others it's probably going to take until after rotation. Thanks for staying to the end of the video. Again, remember to like and subscribe to get further content like this throughout the rest of Murders at Karlov Manor spoiler season, where we'll look at rares, commons, and uncommons that I feel are the best from the set. Thanks for staying to the end of the video, and I'll see you next time.